"Miss Dawson, this conservatory does not accept amateurs." Those were the words that shattered Lena's hopes at the door. A foster girl with no pedigree turned away without playing a single note, until a broken piano, an open door, and a haunting melody changed everything. This is the story of a girl who played from the crowd, silenced 1,000 critics, and rewrote the very definition of genius. What she did on that stage left judges trembling, professors reeling, and the audience in tears. They thought she didn't belong. She showed them the sound of someone becoming. Watch to the end. It's not just about music. It's about reclaiming the voice the world tried to take away. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now, let's get back to the story. "You're not on the list," the man said flatly, not even glancing up from the clipboard. "I submitted my form last month," Lena whispered, her voice barely rising above the murmur of the grand hallway. "Please, I emailed twice. I have my sheet music here. You'll see." The man sighed as if she'd interrupted his lunch. "Miss, we have no time for walk-ins. This is the conservatory showcase, not a community talent fair." His words struck with precision, but it was the way he said them, like her presence was a stain on the polished floor, that stung deepest. Lena's hands tightened around her music folder, already soft at the edges from too many rehearsals and dreams folded into its seams. Her heart was thudding in her ears, louder than the crisp notes drifting through the marble corridor from the performance hall. This was supposed to be the moment. Not her triumph, maybe, but her chance. "I'm not a walk-in," she tried again, softly but firmly. "My name is Lena Dawson. I saved for months to be here. I paid the fee. Please just check again." This time, the man looked up. An older gentleman with silver hair combed so precisely it looked carved. Director Halbridge read the gold placard pinned above his heart. Lena already knew the name. She'd read it on every brochure, heard it whispered like a legend in every threadbare practice room across the city. His eyes scanned her like she was a smudge on a polished Steinway. "Miss Dawson," he repeated, the corners of his mouth twitching, not with a smile, but something far more practiced, disdain. "Your form was noted and rejected." Her breath caught. "I don't understand. We reviewed your submission, your background, your education, or rather, your lack of it, your performance history, which appears to consist of nothing. We reserve these spots for young artists of pedigree, not hobbyists who tinker with keys in church basements." He said it with the ease of someone who'd used those words 100 times to crush 100 other dreams. But Lena's knees still buckled under their weight. "I've played since I was 6, she said, the words unraveling. "I studied. I practiced. Every day, I wrote the piece I submitted." "Self-composed?" he scoffed. "My dear girl, this is a conservatory, not a coffeehouse open mic night. Talent is only as good as its foundation." The hallway was suddenly colder, the silence around her heavier than applause could ever be. Behind him, the doorway to the main auditorium stood open just a crack. Through it, the warm spill of stage light flickered against red velvet curtains. A Chopin etude swelled in the background, performed with technical precision. It should have inspired her. Instead, it mocked her. Halbridge turned, dismissing her as if her very existence inconvenienced the air around him. "Next," he called to the usher. "We're already running behind." A girl in a pearl-stitched gown floated past Lena without a glance, the scent of lilacs trailing behind her. Her heels clicked like a countdown on polished stone. Lena stood frozen, a small figure in a faded gray sweater, holding music written on recycled paper. A whisper escaped her lips, not directed at anyone, just a quiet protest to the ceiling, the walls, to herself. "I just wanted to be heard." She stepped back. No one noticed. The people in line chatted and moved forward, eager and spotless, draped in future accolades. Lena turned slowly and walked down the corridor, away from the gold-plated doors, her footsteps soft but staggering. By the time she reached the lobby, the music from inside felt like it came from a world she could never enter. She found an empty bench in the corner, half hidden beneath a poster that read, "Excellence is not taught, it's born." She sank into the wood like a paper boat drifting into quiet ruin, her sheet music now trembling in her lap. A few parents nearby glanced at her with mild curiosity, just long enough to recognize she didn't belong. One mother whispered to her son, nodding toward Lena like she was a lesson. "That's why you prepare properly, so you don't embarrass yourself like that." Lena didn't flinch, not outwardly. She just stared at the floor, her thoughts loud and chaotic. Every part of her screamed to leave, to run and never look back. But some last fragile thread of defiance kept her rooted. It was then she heard the squeak of a mop bucket. Mr. Reynolds. He was the building's janitor, an older man with eyes that had seen too much and judged too little. He wore a faded ball cap with the words, "Music is soul," stitched in navy thread. She'd seen him before during late practice nights, always pushing the mop down silent corridors while she played alone on the abandoned second-floor upright. He noticed her now, paused mid-stride. "Miss Lena," he said warmly, wiping his hands on a towel as he shuffled closer. "You don't look like someone who just walked out of a concert hall." She gave a breath that was almost a laugh. "They wouldn't let me in." His brow furrowed. "You didn't play?" "No," she whispered. "Apparently I don't have the right pedigree." Mr. Reynolds sat down beside her, letting out a groan like the bench was made of thorns. He nodded slowly, glancing toward the music hall. "They forget," he said, "that Mozart was writing sonatas before he had a last name anyone cared about." Lena said nothing. "They forget," he continued, voice soft but solid, "that Billie Holiday never read a note but made the world weep. That music ain't born in a conservatory. It's born in pain, in waiting, in people like you." A single tear rolled down her cheek. He didn't wipe it away, just let it fall. "You wrote that piece yourself?" he asked. She nodded. "I heard you once, up on the second floor. You thought nobody was listening." "I didn't want to disturb anyone." "Darlin'," he said, smiling gently, "that piece disturbed me in the best way." She looked at him, her eyes wide. "Don't let one man's arrogance rewrite your symphony," he said, rising. "Play. Somewhere, anywhere. Don't stop." With that, he nodded and pushed his mop bucket forward, humming softly as he disappeared down the hall. Lena looked at her sheet music again, stained now by her own fingerprints and salt. One man had rejected her. One man had believed in her. The question was, which voice would she let guide her next note? She folded the pages carefully, stood up with quiet resolve, and walked slowly toward the back entrance of the auditorium. Not to perform, not officially, but to listen. To breathe the same air as those who belonged. She had no idea the doors were cracked just enough. She had no idea her moment was waiting, only a few chords away. "Look at her," someone whispered, just loud enough to be cruel. Lena froze near the back wall of the auditorium, her fingers tightening around the folded score pressed against her chest. The voice had come from 2 rows ahead, an older woman with her silver hair pinned like a sculpture and a daughter whose dress shimmered like water under the golden lights. The girl, perhaps 16, maybe younger, glanced back over her shoulder and gave Lena the kind of look someone might give a wrinkle in their gown. It wasn't just judgment, it was dismissal, served with an icy smile and perfect posture. "She's not even dressed for this place," the woman muttered again, turning back to the stage. "Some people simply don't know when they're out of place." The words weren't meant for Lena directly, but they didn't have to be. They cut sharper when whispered, when you were supposed to pretend you didn't hear. She remained standing, too unsure of whether to sit or retreat. The back row was sparsely filled. A few late arrivals settled in, murmuring politely, as a polished young man began a swift, seamless run through a Rachmaninoff prelude on stage. The room, grand, domed, velvet-lined, should have felt like a cathedral for music. Instead, it felt like a fortress, one where she was an intruder. She finally sat down, folding her knees close, trying to disappear into the velvet seat. "Lena?" The voice startled her. It came not from the stage or from the rows ahead, but from the side aisle, where the maintenance door had just swung open. Mr. Reynolds stood there, mop bucket abandoned for now, his gray uniform still streaked with polish and dust. His eyes softened when he saw the way she was folded into herself like a wilted stem. "You all right?" She gave him the gentlest nod she could manage. "Just watching." He gave her a half smile. "Funny. You look more like someone waiting to be heard than someone watching." She wanted to smile back. She tried. But the ache inside her had bloomed into something larger. Shame. Not for being rejected, but for daring to believe she wouldn't be. "You ever hear what they used to say about Billy?" he continued quietly, lowering himself into the seat beside her. Said her voice had too much smoke, too much sorrow. Not trained, not proper. She sang anyway. Didn't wait for permission. Lena glanced down at her sheet music again. She remembered the first time she'd written a melody. She was 9, living in her 5th foster home in 2 years. The world back then had been made of noise, shouting, sirens, doors slamming. The only place that held stillness was a storage room in a local rec center, where a cracked baby grand sat neglected under tarps. She would sneak in, press a single key, and listen. Not to the note, but to the silence that followed. That, more than anything, taught her how to compose. "I don't want to cause trouble," she whispered. Mr. Reynolds shook his head. "Music isn't trouble, Lena. Sometimes it's the only thing holding people together." Before she could answer, the next performance began. A girl in a satin blue gown sat at the gleaming Steinway Center stage. Her fingers flowed like water, executing Liszt with grace. The audience responded with polite admiration. Another name checked off, another nod from Hallbridge near the judge's box. Lena felt the walls closing again. She looked up and noticed something. Clara, the young assistant seated beside the judges, staring back at her. Unlike Hallbridge, whose expression was chiseled stone, Clara's face held curiosity, and something else. A question. Recognition? Lena turned away. Maybe she'd heard the music through the doors once. Maybe she'd passed the second-floor hallway and heard Lena playing after hours, when the lights had dimmed and the janitor's cart squeaked past empty lockers. Another performer took the stage, then another. Time was a blur. Applause rose and fell like tides. Lena sat quietly through it all, the music threading through her ribs like a second heartbeat. She could hear every note, every misplaced hesitation, every technical perfection that lacked something deeper, emotion. Then came Victoria. The girl who had scoffed at her in the corridor now stood with pristine elegance, her posture drilled into her from years of recitals and rehearsals. Her fingers moved expertly through a Bach invention. Every note was sharp, clear, dry, like glass on glass. When she finished, the applause was thunderous but not emotional. It was recognition of craft, not connection. Lena remained still while inside her something began to burn. Not envy, not spite. Hunger, a hunger she had buried in silence. When the intermission was called, she rose with the crowd. Slowly, carefully, she moved past the rows and out the side exit. Mr. Reynolds watched her go but didn't follow. He knew the look on her face. He'd seen it in the mirror once, 40 years ago, before life handed him a mop instead of the mic he once chased. Lena didn't head for the lobby. Instead, she turned down the backstage hallway, where the air smelled of old wood and piano wax. This was the side of the building few noticed, a world of shadows, forgotten cables, and practice stools. And there, in a corner beneath a stained glass window, stood the battered upright piano. She knew it well. Its ivory keys were chipped, its middle pedals stuck, but its sound, when played with feeling, still sang. She opened the cover slowly, like lifting the lid on something sacred. She placed her sheet music atop the wobbling stand, took a breath, and let her fingers hover. She didn't begin with the opening notes. She began with silence. Then, slowly, gently, she pressed into the first chord. The sound was soft, haunted, almost. Then came the second, then the third. A melody began to form, not practiced, not performed, lived. Unbeknownst to her, the stage doors had been left ajar. Not wide, but enough for the sound to creep in like sunlight through a crack. Clara, returning from the judge's lounge, heard it first. She stopped mid-step in the corridor, tilted her head. A hush came over the nearby hallway as the music grew. Not louder, but fuller, richer, like breath finding its lungs for the first time. Inside the auditorium, the crowd was beginning to settle for the second half. When a few heads turned, the melody floated faintly, like a whisper behind velvet. People paused, listening. Hallbridge frowned. "Who's playing?" he snapped. Clara didn't answer. She was already walking toward the sound, drawn like a thread being pulled through cloth. On stage, the next performer stood frozen, waiting for cue, yet the audience remained distracted. Whispers now. "Do you hear that? Who's playing backstage? It's not on the program." Lena, unaware of any of it, kept playing. Her fingers trembled at first, then found strength. The piece, her piece, wasn't showy. It wasn't made for competition. It was written at night in foster homes, in borrowed light, in loneliness, in longing. It spoke to something beneath the skin. Outside the door, Clara stood motionless, tears quietly forming in her eyes. Inside, Helbridge rose from his chair. "Shut it off," he ordered. "Who authorized this?" No one moved. Even the usher, startled, remained rooted, listening. And in the corner of the backstage hall, Lena reached the crescendo of her song, not with grandeur, but with grace, like forgiveness, like release. She didn't know yet that the tide had begun to shift. She didn't know eyes were turning, that the world she thought had closed its doors was now, moment by moment, beginning to listen. The final note lingered in the air like a held breath. Lena's hands hovered just above the keys, suspended in silence. The world outside the battered upright piano had vanished, replaced by the slow, aching unravel of her song, her story. For the first time in weeks, the tremor in her fingertips had stilled. The melody had wrapped itself around her ribs like a quiet exhale, and she hadn't once thought about judges or perfection. She had simply played. She blinked, suddenly aware of the tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. Release. She reached forward and gently lowered the cover over the keys, like tucking an old friend to sleep. She stood slowly, unaware of what she'd left behind her. But outside the cracked door, the hush had become something else entirely. The murmurs started first, a ripple across the auditorium like wind brushing through tall grass. People shifted in their seats, eyes darted toward the back, toward the origin of the sound that had broken through practiced scales and polished technique, and somehow left a silence more powerful than applause. "What was that?" someone asked. "Who's playing back there?" It wasn't on the program. From the judge's table, Helbridge's jaw tensed, his hand flattened against the polished surface in front of him, knuckles whitening as his gaze locked on the side corridor where Clara still stood frozen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her lips parted, and for the first time that evening, she wasn't writing notes on a clipboard or timing performances. She was simply listening. He barked her name, sharp like a whip crack. "Clara, who authorized that?" But she didn't turn to him. Instead, she walked. Her shoes clicked gently on the marble floor as she followed the thread of sound. The audience fell into a lull, eyes tracking her path with growing curiosity. Helbridge rose from his seat, fury trembling beneath his finely tailored coat. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," he said to the crowd, attempting to salvage control. "There appears to be a disruption backstage. A student must have mistaken the timing. We'll resume shortly." But no one clapped. No one smiled. In fact, no one moved. The atmosphere had shifted. Something raw, unfiltered had crept through the conservatory's polished armor, and the room wasn't ready to let it go. Clara reached the corner just as Lena stepped out into the back hallway, clutching her sheet music again. She stopped abruptly when she saw the young assistant in front of her. Their eyes met. "You played that?" Clara asked, voice barely a whisper. Lena swallowed, unsure how to answer. "Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt anything." Clara shook her head. "No, don't apologize, ever." She took a careful step closer. "That piece, what was it?" "I wrote it," Lena said. Her voice was barely audible. "It's called Winter in C minor. I wrote it the year my foster brother left. I didn't know where he went, but I imagined he could hear me, so I wrote for him." Clara's hands trembled around the clipboard she still held. "Mr. Helbridge, he turned you away?" she asked gently. Lena nodded. "He said I wasn't trained, that I didn't belong." Clara looked toward the main hall, where the crowd now shifted with growing restlessness, waiting for answers. "He was wrong," she said. Lena blinked, unsure if she'd heard her right. But before either of them could say another word, a booming voice echoed down the corridor. "There you are." Helbridge stormed toward them like a storm gathering speed, his shoes clicking like thunder on the floor. "Miss Dawson, I believe I made myself clear earlier. This is not a venue for unauthorized performances." His voice curled around the word like it was venom. Lena stood her ground, even as her pulse pounded in her throat. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. She was only playing music," Clara interrupted, stepping in front of Lena. Helbridge's eyes narrowed. "That is not your decision to defend." Clara didn't flinch. Maybe not. But the audience heard her, the students heard her, and I heard her. Helbridge's eyes darted toward the main doors. where more people were beginning to gather near the edges. Some leaned out into the hallway. Even the next performer, waiting by the curtains, seemed unsure whether to proceed or to listen. "Let's be clear," Halbridge hissed. "She is not a student. She is not registered. She does not belong here. If we allow every ambitious amateur to hijack our showcase—" "She didn't hijack anything," Clara said softly but firmly. "She reminded us why we fell in love with music in the first place." For a moment, the silence between them felt like a held breath. Then, from behind them, a single sound rose. Clapping. It started with a girl near the stage, a shy student with large glasses who had earlier stumbled during her performance. She stood now, slowly clapping, her eyes fixed on Lena. Then another person joined, and another. Soon the clapping became applause, not wild, not forced, but slow, building, honest. Halbridge turned to face the growing ovation, disbelief hardening his expression. He raised a hand as if he could stop it, contain it, but the sound grew. The crowd wasn't clapping because they knew Lena's name. They were clapping because they had felt something, and in a place so obsessed with perfection, that had become rare. "I suggest you handle this wisely," Clara said under her breath to Halbridge, "because the board members are in that audience, and they're watching this unfold." He said nothing, just turned his face storm cloud gray and retreated toward the wings like a general losing ground. Clara looked back at Lena and smiled. "You belong," she whispered. Lena didn't speak. Her throat was too tight. Her eyes shimmered. For the first time that day, she wasn't invisible. She was undeniable. The applause was still echoing when Lena stepped back, overwhelmed. She wasn't ready for this. She had come here with nothing but a worn-out folder and a hope so fragile it barely survived the train ride. Now strangers were clapping. Not for a name they recognized, not for an institution they revered, but for something they felt in their chest, something she had made. I shouldn't stay," she murmured to Clara, her voice cracking. This isn't how it was supposed to happen." Clara placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Maybe it's exactly how it was supposed to happen." More faces were visible now through the glass-pane doors, peeking from the aisle, rising in their seats. Some leaned toward the entryway, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl whose music had stolen the room's breath. Lena looked down, her eyes wide and uncertain. "They'll forget me tomorrow. This won't change anything." Clara studied her face, saw the guarded fear, the instinct to vanish before the world could take back its moment of kindness. "No, they won't," she said, "and it already has." Just then, a tall man in a navy vest stepped forward from the crowd. Mr. Sinclair, head of the conservatory's board. A man Lena had only seen in brochures, whose presence usually lingered behind gala tables and glossy press statements. But now he walked with urgency and purpose, cutting through the divide between elite and unknown with every step. He reached Clara first, nodded politely, and turned to Lena with a look of restrained awe. "You wrote that piece?" Lena hesitated, then nodded. Her hands trembled slightly around her music sheets. Sinclair extended his hand. "My name is Thomas Sinclair. I've sat through 27 showcases, heard hundreds of prodigies. That piece..." His voice trailed off, and he shook his head slowly. "It wasn't just beautiful. It meant something. It didn't care about approval. It spoke." Lena stood motionless, as if his words might collapse the floor beneath her. "I'm sorry you weren't given a place on the program," he continued, glancing briefly toward the judge's table. "But if you're willing, I'd like you to finish the evening, on stage, for everyone." Her heart dropped to her knees. "No," she said, stepping back. "I can't. That piano isn't mine. I didn't prepare for this." Sinclair smiled, patient. "Preparation is what brought us here. Heart is what brought you here." Lena looked to Clara, eyes pleading. "What if I fail?" Clara's voice was steady. "What if you don't?" Lena stared down at her sheet music, the pages that had held her story for years. Notes inked in flickering light, scribbled in laundromats between shifts at diners, while the world told her she was dreaming too loudly. Her fingers brushed the opening chord. This wasn't just about music anymore. This was about reclaiming the voice she'd been taught to lower, the soul she'd been told to hide. She drew a breath so deep it trembled in her chest, and nodded. Within minutes, the stage crew cleared a path. Performers stood aside. The crowd leaned forward in hushed anticipation as the announcer stepped up to the microphone, fumbling for words that didn't sound rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice cracking slightly, "we have a special addition to our program. A self-composed piece that captured something we didn't even know we'd been missing. Please welcome Lena Dawson." Her name rippled across the auditorium like a question just beginning to find its answer. Lena stepped onto the stage slowly. Her shoes, simple canvas, whispered against the lacquered wood. Her sweater sleeves brushed her wrists. She looked nothing like the performers before her, but in that contrast she was unforgettable. She approached the Steinway at center stage. It loomed in front of her like a cathedral altar. For a second she froze. The lights above felt impossibly bright. The silence thickened. Her hands hovered over the keys. She looked into the audience, and there in the third row she spotted him. Mr. Reynolds, the janitor. He sat straighter than anyone else in the room, his cap held respectfully in his lap, his weathered face lit with a smile that said, "Play it like nobody owns the hall but you." Lena closed her eyes and began. The first chord was soft, almost too soft. Then came the second, low, aching, like an old memory rising in the dark. Then the melody took shape, slow and searching, full of tenderness and grief, wonder and longing. It was the same piece she had played backstage, but now it bloomed with new depth, carried by the hush of 1,000 held breaths. The hall was suspended in stillness. No coughs, no rustles, just the quiet surrender to sound. Each note seemed to reach into someone different, touching the lonely father in the back row, the widowed grandmother near the aisle, the teacher remembering the student who disappeared too soon. It was not technical brilliance, it was not conservatory polish, it was honest, and it shattered every wall that had once kept her out. Lena's body moved with the music, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, like she was breathing each phrase into the piano itself. At one point, near the bridge, she faltered for the briefest second, a chord delayed by the swell in her throat. But that imperfection made it real, made it hers. By the final crescendo, something had changed. She wasn't trying to belong anymore. She was claiming the space. She struck the last note like a full stop at the end of a letter that had taken years to write. Then silence, a silence so deep it felt sacred. And then the room erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was awe. People stood, some cried, some simply placed their hands over their hearts and stayed silent, reverent. Lena sat still on the bench, stunned. The applause blurred into a wave that lifted her gently from the edge of obscurity into something she never dared to name, recognition. She stood slowly and bowed. But before she could leave the stage, something happened. Mr. Halbridge, stone-faced, walked to the microphone. His presence brought a hush over the room again, not out of respect but uncertainty. He looked at Lena, then at the crowd. He cleared his throat. "We misjudged," he said. The words sounded foreign in his mouth. He turned to Lena stiffly. "Miss Dawson, your performance was exceptional." It wasn't an apology, but it was a crack in the wall. Lena nodded once and turned away. She didn't need his approval anymore. She had already played past it. The evening wind had picked up by the time Lena stepped out of the auditorium, her sweater sleeves pulled down over her palms, the applause still pulsing faintly in her chest like a second heartbeat. Her hair fluttered against her cheeks, strands catching on the salt of tears she hadn't realized were still drying. The night air felt different now. Cooler, cleaner, as if it had been listening too. Behind her, the grand doors slowly eased closed, muffling the fading buzz of conversation still echoing through the marble halls. She had stood on a stage where she was never meant to be, and for once, the world hadn't told her to sit down. She crossed the plaza outside the conservatory slowly, her pace unsure, as if afraid the ground might vanish beneath her if she moved too quickly. In her hand, she still clutched the pages of Winter in C minor, now curled slightly at the corners. They looked worn and unremarkable, but they were the reason everything had changed. "Miss Dawson?" The voice came from behind her, urgent but kind. She turned and saw Clara jogging across the steps, heels clicking against the stone, her hair unpinned now, her face bright with something that looked like pride. "I'm glad I caught you," Clara said, slightly breathless. "Mr. Sinclair, he'd like to meet with you again, officially. And—" She hesitated, then smiled. "He's offering you a place, a full scholarship, all 4 years, composition and performance if you want both." Lena stared at her, stunned. The words hung in the air like a chord unresolved. I don't have a resume, or theory classes, or formal lessons. He knows, Clara interrupted softly. That's why he's doing it, because he heard what we all did, and because the only thing more tragic than someone like you not having a place is someone like you not being heard. Lena's breath caught, a soft gasp lost in the wind. I can't pay for books or housing. Everything, Clara said. Covered. A silence passed between them, deep and wide, broken only by the soft creak of the old iron lanterns overhead. Then Lena asked the question that had sat quietly at the base of her heart since the moment Halbridge had first looked through her. What about him? Clara's expression darkened, just slightly. Mr. Halbridge was advised to step aside from admissions decisions. Sinclair didn't say much, but the board saw what happened tonight, and more importantly, they saw who was watching. Lena didn't ask further. She didn't need to. Some storms didn't need thunder to announce their arrival. Some crumbled from within quietly when truth arrived like sunlight in the cracks. She looked away, then back at Clara. Can I think about it? Clara nodded. Of course. But just so you know, this place needs you more than you need it. She left her with a quiet wave and turned back toward the building. Lena stood there for a long while, staring up at the windows glowing gold against the blue-black night. She didn't know what the future would hold, only that it had opened a little wider than before. The sound of footsteps drew her from her thoughts. Didn't want to crowd the celebration, said a familiar voice. Low and warm. Mr. Reynolds stood at the base of the steps, hands in his coat pockets, cap tilted slightly against the breeze. His smile was soft, the kind of smile a man wears when he sees a flower grow through concrete and remembers when it was just dirt and silence. You stayed? She asked, walking down to meet him. I stay for the magic, he replied, and that was real. She looked at him, eyes bright. You were the only one who saw me before anyone did. Thank you. He shook his head. Don't thank me. I just listened. The music did the rest. She stepped closer, lifting the pages in her hand. I wrote this in the rec center you used to clean. I played it on that warped piano by the broken vending machine. He chuckled. And I told the staff not to junk that piano, said it still had stories in it. She held out the pages. I want you to have the first copy. He stared at them for a moment, then took them gently, like holding something sacred. He didn't read the notes, just closed them against his chest and nodded. I'm proud of you, he said. But more than that, I'm proud that you didn't ask anyone for permission to be who you are. She smiled through the lump in her throat. I almost didn't play at all, but you did, he said, and look what followed. The breeze picked up again. Somewhere, a distant church bell rang the hour. I don't know if I belong here, she admitted softly. He looked at her, eyes kind. The ones who ask that question usually deserve to stay the most. They stood in quiet for a while, the moment stretching between them like the space between notes. Unspoken, but full of meaning. When they finally parted, Lena didn't walk away from the building with her head down. She walked forward like someone who had finally stepped into her own story. The city felt different that night, as if somewhere, someone had heard a new song carried by the wind and paused just long enough to wonder where it came from. And somewhere inside the conservatory, Director Halbridge sat alone in his office, the door closed, the lights dim. The echo of Lena's performance still rang in the bones of the walls, uninvited, unforgettable. He looked at the judge's notes scattered across his desk. All perfect, all predictable. None of them mattered now. He'd built his life on control, on filtering brilliance through pedigree and polish, and in a single evening, a girl with second-hand shoes and a melody carved from grief had undone it all. The conservatory looked different in daylight, not softer, just clearer, the way a painting reveals its cracks once sunlight falls directly across its frame. Lena stood at the entrance on her first official day, the scholarship acceptance form folded in her back pocket like a promise she still couldn't quite believe she'd been allowed to keep. She wore the same sweater she'd performed in, though she had stitched up the loose seam on the cuff the night before. Her shoes were clean now, but they still bore the creases from years of walking between places that never fully claimed her. As the grand doors swung open, the same corridors that once whispered rejection now echoed with something new, footsteps that belonged, almost. Clara had met her at the front desk that morning with a small folder, her smile bright but composed, as if she understood that too much warmth would feel like charity. Instead, she handed Lena her schedule and a single sheet of typed names: faculty mentors, assigned theory instructors, and at the top, private piano, Dr. Alden Rice. Lena's eyes had widened at the name. "You know him?" Clara asked. "I've read everything he's published," Lena replied softly. "He teaches advanced postgraduate composition. He's brilliant." Clara's voice was calm but firm. "He asked for you." That wasn't a sentence Lena had ever heard in her life. She walked slowly through the main hallway, past columns and marble and walls lined with framed portraits, faces of composers and prodigies, all staring back with eyes that had known applause. And still she felt them watching, measuring her silence, her stride, her clothes. In her first class, music theory 2, she felt it more clearly. The professor, a short man with a staccato voice and neatly pressed trousers, didn't pause when she entered. But the students did. Heads turned. Whispers flitted like gnats between rows. "Is that the girl? The one who played from the crowd? I heard she doesn't even have a high school diploma. She was homeless. She just got lucky." The comments didn't need to be loud. They only needed to echo. Lena sat in the back, her hands flat on the desk, her notebook closed. When the professor asked a question about diminished seventh intervals and no one answered, she knew the answer. But her voice stayed locked in her throat. She wasn't sure if they wanted her to speak or just to be reminded she was still there. She didn't answer the next question either, or the next. By lunchtime, the ache in her shoulders had spread to her chest. The cafeteria wasn't any kinder. She found a quiet table near the window, opened a banana and the half sandwich she had packed from home, and tried not to look at anyone. But someone looked at her. "Lena, right?" A voice, delicate, female, tried to sound friendly. She turned and saw a tall girl with ice blonde hair, a conservatory crest stitched into her sweater. "I'm Victoria. I think we met before." She smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. Lena nodded once. "I remember." Victoria sat without asking. "That performance of yours, incredible, really. I mean, not perfect, obviously, but so raw, so authentic." Lena blinked slowly. "Thanks. I mean, it's inspiring, isn't it?" Victoria went on. "That someone without any training or background could just show up and make people cry." She sipped from a water bottle with a glint of triumph in her tone. "Just imagine what you'll be able to do once you're actually trained." The words landed softly, but they didn't need to be sharp. They were a sugar-coated dismissal, praise wrapped in pity. Lena didn't respond. She just stood, quietly picked up her tray, and walked out. She found the old practice rooms on the third floor by accident, following the sound of a cello tuning itself against silence. The rooms smelled like varnish and pencil shavings. She chose one without a window, lit by a single overhead bulb and a flickering red exit sign in the hallway. She sat at the upright piano, fingers hovering. Here, there were no whispers, no eyes, only keys. She played the opening lines of Winter in C minor, slower than usual. Then she stopped. It didn't feel the same. Not here, where everything echoed off the sterile walls and tried to remind her she didn't belong. She played again, this time improvising. She moved through scales like someone wandering an unfamiliar house, feeling her way through doorways without turning on the light. That's where Clara found her. An hour later, standing just outside the door, listening. "You skipped your mentorship meeting," she said gently. Lena stopped playing, her spine straightening. "I didn't mean to. I just didn't think I should go. Not yet." "Why?" "I don't think I'm ready." Clara stepped into the room and sat beside her on the worn bench. "You know, when I first got this job, I spent my entire first month making coffee for people who never learned my name." Lena glanced sideways at her. "I had a master's," Clara continued. "Still do, in performance and music psychology. But it didn't matter. I didn't look like someone who belonged on this side of the office. I smiled and nodded and waited for someone to invite me into a conversation." "Did they?" Lena asked. "Eventually, but only after I stopped waiting." Lena looked back at the keys. Her fingers drifted to the same familiar chord. "I don't want to be someone's story," she whispered. "I don't want to be the lucky girl who played once and then faded out." "Then don't," Clara said. "Play again." Lena turned. "What if I can't live up to it?" Clara placed a hand gently over hers on the keys. "You don't have to live up to a moment," she said. You only have to live into your music. That's where your power is. Not in what they remember, but in what you keep choosing to say. For a long moment, Lena didn't speak. Then she played. Not Winter in C minor, not the polished parts she'd shown the world, but something new, uneven, incomplete. A piece still becoming. It wasn't ready for a stage, but it was hers. And for now, that was enough. The door to Dr. Alden Rice's studio was unlike the others. Where most professors displayed neat placards and perfectly typed schedules, his door was bare, just a single hand-carved treble clef hanging from a nail slightly off-center. Lena hesitated outside it, the folder of blank composition paper pressed tight to her chest. Her heart ticked like a metronome, just out of rhythm. She was 3 minutes early. That felt late. She raised her hand to knock, but before her knuckles could touch the wood, the door creaked open. "Come in," came a deep voice. Measured, not unkind. Dr. Rice was already at the piano, facing away, lost in something he was playing. Slow, almost meditative, a piece with long silences between notes. His gray curls hung slightly over his collar, and a thick pencil was tucked behind his ear. A half-drunk mug of coffee sat on the floor by the pedal. The room smelled faintly of sandalwood, paper, and old vinyl records. Lena stepped inside and waited. "You're Lena Dawson," he said, finishing the phrase, finally letting the last note ring. "The girl who made half the board cry." "Yes," she answered carefully. He turned to face her. His eyes were bright but tired, the kind of tired that came from a life spent listening closely. "Have a seat," he said, nodding to the smaller piano bench beside his. "You compose. That's good. Too many people here just imitate." Lena sat cautiously. He looked at her, not unkindly, but not easily impressed either. "Tell me," he said, "why music?" She blinked. I don't know how to answer that." He raised an eyebrow. "Then you're not ready to write anything that matters." She stiffened, but before the shame could fully bloom in her chest, he continued. "Try again," she swallowed. "Because it's the only place I can be, all of me." He nodded once. "Better." He slid a sheet of blank staff paper in front of her. "Right. Now?" "Yes." She looked down, startled. "But I don't even know what I'm writing. That's why you're here. Write what you don't know." Her hand shook slightly as she took the pencil from the side of the bench. The first note was the hardest, always. Not because she feared being wrong, but because it required silence first. Real silence. The kind that asks you to listen to yourself. Before the world intruded, she wrote an A minor chord, then a D, then stopped. Ray said nothing, only watched her. Not with judgment, but patience. After a few more minutes, she had a handful of measures. She passed him the page. He studied it for a long time, then looked up. "You're thinking too much," he said. "It's clean, but it's not alive." Lena's heart sank. "I wanted to show you something correct." "I don't want correct," he said sharply. "I want true. If you want to be correct, go take dictation. If you want to move someone, then you have to bleed a little." She sat back, chastened. But beneath the sting of his words was something else, an invitation. "Bring me something next week," he said. "Something you never thought you'd let anyone hear." And just like that, he turned back to the piano and began to play again. Dismissed, but not discarded. Lena stood and left the room quietly, her thoughts spinning, the half-started melody still floating in her mind like a question that hadn't yet formed. That night, she stayed in the practice room until long after the building emptied. She turned off the overhead light, leaving only the glow of the exit sign to paint the walls red. She sat at the piano bench, pulled out her worn pages, and started again, not with a goal, not with a structure, but with memory. She played the sound of footsteps on foster home stairs, the ache of birthdays spent alone, the hum of the street lamp outside the shelter that flickered every 5 minutes like a stubborn heartbeat. She played not what was beautiful, but what was true. What came out was something wild, not polished, not perfect, but hers. The next morning, she handed Dr. Rice a crumpled page with smeared pencil markings and no title. He said nothing at first. He played it, slowly, then again. When he finished, he looked at her. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is your voice. Don't lose it trying to sound like someone else." Tears stung behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Name it," he added. She hesitated. Then, "Nocturne for a Place That Never Existed." He gave a small, approving grunt. Over the next weeks, something began to shift. Dr. Rice never praised, but he never looked away. When she wrote clumsily, he made her explain why. When she played beautifully, he asked what she'd sacrificed for it. When she tried to impress him, he saw through it. But when she told the truth in her music, even when it came out broken, he leaned in. Lena started to find her footing. Her hands grew steadier, her instincts bolder. She still avoided the cafeteria, still heard the whispers, but they no longer clung to her like they had before. Every night, the piano became her sanctuary again. Not a place to prove herself, but a place to find herself. Still, it wasn't all peace. One afternoon, as she stepped out of Rice's studio, she found Victoria waiting in the hallway, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Interesting how quickly things change," she said. Lena stopped, wary. "What do you want?" Victoria's voice was silk over glass. "I want to know how it feels to be the new poster child, to walk in from nowhere and have everyone throw open doors for you." "I didn't ask for that." "No," Victoria said, stepping closer. "But you played from the crowd, and now they act like you invented music." Lena's hands curled slightly at her sides. "Careful," Victoria added, her voice lower now. "Spotlights are fickle, and when they move on, it gets very dark." Lena didn't respond. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned and walked down the hall, her heartbeat steady, her purpose clear. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't playing for applause. She was playing to heal. And no spotlight could reach as far as the fire she'd found inside herself. The recital was less than a week away when the posters went up. Thick cream paper, black serif font, gilded trim. They lined the halls like quiet proclamations, announcing the upcoming Winter Conservatory Showcase, an invitation-only evening performance for patrons, faculty, alumni, and select students. At the bottom, beneath a list of the usual names, sons and daughters of conductors, symphony soloists, and international competitors, was hers. Lena Dawson. Nocturne for a place that never existed. She had stared at the poster for nearly a full minute before reaching out to touch it, as if her name might smear like wet ink. She hadn't told anyone, not even Clara. Dr. Rice had submitted her piece without asking. "You don't ask someone to speak," he'd said. "You just hand them the microphone." Now the whole conservatory knew. That week, eyes followed her wherever she went, curious, assessing, and in some cases, cold. The whispers returned too, cloaked as commentary. "She's playing again. I thought that was a fluke. She's being propped up by Rice. You know how he is with outliers. I heard he's grooming her to take his place." Lena ignored them, though each word landed like the edge of a broken key. She didn't ask for their approval. But still, she felt their weight. Each evening she returned to the same third-floor practice room. She didn't want the grand rehearsal spaces. The chipped, upright, and flickering overhead light had become her cathedral. The piano's quirks no longer frustrated her. They reminded her of herself. She ran the piece over and over, not to perfect it, but to understand it again. It was different now. She was different. The girl who wrote those notes in the shadow of fear was no longer the same girl preparing to play them in front of a room full of patrons in evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. And yet, part of her still was. One night, after a long rehearsal, she stepped out into the hallway and found Clara waiting by the staircase. "You should be in the big hall," Clara said softly. "That old piano barely holds its tuning." Lena offered a faint smile. "Neither do I." Clara walked beside her down the stairs. The halls were nearly empty, soft lamplight pouring through the stained glass windows like honey. "Do you ever feel like you're walking into a fire?" Lena asked suddenly. "All the time," Clara answered. Lena stopped walking. "I'm afraid they'll hear it and think I don't belong again." Clara faced her. "And what if they do?" Lena hesitated. "Then I play anyway." Clara's smile was quiet but proud. "Exactly." On the day of the recital, Lena arrived early. The performance hall shimmered with chandeliers, the air heavy with perfume, conversation, and the unspoken hierarchy of old money and musical legacy. Programs were passed hand to hand like miniature status symbols. Names were whispered with reverence, none of them hers. Backstage, the students waited in tense silence. Some stared into mirrors, others warmed up on invisible keys. Victoria stood near the center, dressed in silver silk, her presence unmistakably poised. Her piece was scheduled directly after Lena's. When Lena entered, Victoria glanced her way with a smirk. "I hope your piece is as heartfelt as your last one." Lena met her eyes evenly. "It is. And this time I wrote it for myself." Victoria tilted her head. How noble. Clara appeared then, clipboard in hand, headset around her neck. You're on in 10, she said to Lena. The lights will dim first, then a single spotlight. They'll announce you. Lena nodded, heart pounding. She sat near the wings, closed her eyes, and pressed her fingers to her pulse. It felt too fast, too loud. But she welcomed it. Nerves meant she still cared. The lights dropped. A hush fell over the crowd like snow. Next, the announcer said, a world premiere composition by Lena Dawson, Nocturne for a Place That Never Existed. Applause rose, scattered but sincere. She walked onto the stage alone. The piano glowed under the spotlight like a monument. She paused, just for a second, then crossed to the bench and sat. Silence again. She closed her eyes and played. It began in shadows, minor thirds and hollow fifths, spaces between breath and memory. The first phrase was soft, almost hesitant. Then, like a bird remembering how to take flight, the melody rose, melancholy but defiant. She let herself sink into the piece. The room disappeared. The velvet seats, the polished shoes, the judging eyes, all gone. What remained was a sound shaped by all the places she had never called home, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, music could build one where none had ever stood. Each section of the nocturne told a different chapter. The lullaby of her first foster mother's humming, the discordant clatter of shelter doors, the hollow silence of forgotten birthdays, the fragile joy of the old rec center piano. But the final section, soft, slow aching, was a prayer, not for acceptance, for peace. She finished with a single note sustained just past its natural end. And then, nothing. Not a whisper, not a cough. Then came the applause. First a murmur, then a wave, then a rising, echoing roar. She stood, bowed, and saw them. Mr. Reynolds in the third row clapping with misted eyes. Clara near the curtain, her hands clasped like she was holding back something too big for her chest. Even Dr. Rice, expression unreadable, but nodding. And somewhere, on the edge of the aisle, Hallbridge. He stood with the rest, but did not clap. Instead, he turned and walked toward the back, his silhouette vanishing into shadow. Lena left the stage trembling, but not with fear. She had played, not to prove herself, not to impress, but because she had something to say. And now, the room had heard her. The article came out 3 days later. A glossy spread in the classical voice, tucked between reviews of international string quartets and the obituary of a once-revered conductor. Yet there, printed in ink as crisp as the conservatory's uniforms, was the title. Unknown pianist captures conservatory's soul. Lena Dawson's Nocturne leaves audience breathless. Beneath it, a photo. Lena mid-performance, head tilted forward, fingers suspended over the keys like a question waiting to be answered. She hadn't known a journalist had been present. Clara had, but said nothing, just smiled now as she handed Lena the magazine, folded to the page already smudged at the corners from rereading. They called you, the voice the conservatory didn't know it was missing, Clara said gently, watching Lena's stunned silence. And you didn't need a last name on a plaque to earn it. Lena didn't speak. She was too afraid she might cry if she did. She traced the photo with her thumb, remembering how it felt in that moment, how the weight of the piano hadn't pressed down but lifted her, how the silence between chords had been filled not with fear, but with truth. She hadn't just played music. She had become it. By the end of the week, her name was everywhere. The conservatory's internal bulletin announced a featured spotlight on her in their spring recital. Faculty emails shifted from indifference to curiosity. Students who once avoided eye contact now paused to compliment her in the halls. Even the whispers changed. She's real. I heard she's writing a full suite. She didn't just get lucky. Still, there were shadows beneath the light. Victoria hadn't spoken to her since the night of the recital, but the coldness in her gaze lingered like a draft in every shared hallway. Other students, especially those groomed since childhood to shine under this roof, watched Lena with a silence that felt rehearsed. Respect, yes, but laced with resistance. And somewhere within the administration, deeper tremors were beginning. Clara told her first. Hallbridge is petitioning the board, she said one morning in the stairwell, her voice hushed. He wants to revisit the criteria for solo features. He claims it's not personal. Lena knew better. Hallbridge had never looked her in the eye since the night of her performance, and yet she could feel him circling. Not with rage, with calculation. That same afternoon, Dr. Rice summoned her to his studio. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble. "You've been offered a place in the Harmonia Fellowship." Lena blinked. I don't know what that is." "It's a private mentorship with the Berlin Chamber Collective. One student from each continent, hand-picked. You'd study, perform, and compose internationally. For a year." She went silent. "It's extremely competitive," he added. "Normally they only consider third-year students, but they heard the recital, and they asked." Lena's stomach fluttered. "I don't know what to say." He studied her for a long moment. "You don't have to say anything yet. Just know, offers like this don't come because of one performance. They come because people recognize something they can't teach." She nodded slowly, but behind the hum of excitement was a flicker of unease. That evening, as she left her final class, she found an envelope taped to her practice room door. No name, just a white card inside, printed in a sterile serif font. "There is no place for spectacle at the expense of legacy. Some doors close for a reason. Know when not to force them open." There was no signature, just the silence it left behind. Lena crumpled the card but kept walking. She said nothing to Clara or Reese, not even Mr. Reynolds, who'd stopped by the practice room 2 nights before with his usual thermos of tea and quiet encouragement. She didn't want to burden them with shadows, but she felt them anyway. In her next theory class, the professor pulled her aside. "I've been asked to review your placement," he said, lips pursed. "It seems your admissions skipped a few formal protocols." She stood frozen. "We'll be conducting an assessment next week, oral and written, just to ensure your scholarship is properly aligned with your abilities." The implication was clear. It was happening, quietly, carefully, but unmistakably. A pushback. Lena returned to her practice room that night with more fury than focus. She played scales hard enough to ache. Her composition draft sat unfinished, mocked by the threat of unraveling before it had even become real. She leaned forward, resting her head against the cool wood above the keys. She was tired, not of playing, of proving, of breathing too carefully, of walking through a place that had embraced her music but never stopped weighing her worth. The door creaked behind her. She turned, startled. It was Clara. She stepped inside without speaking, carrying something in her hand, a worn envelope. She passed it to Lena. "It's from Dr. Rice," she said softly. "He asked me to give it to you, said if you started hearing too many voices that weren't your own, read it." Lena opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. Handwritten, no preamble, just this. "The notes you play aren't what makes people listen. It's the silence you survive between them. Play from that, and nothing they say will be louder than your truth." Below it, in small script, Lena folded the paper and placed it inside her sheet music folder. She sat down, took a breath, and began to write again. This time, not for school, not for acceptance, not even for the fellowship. She wrote for the girl who first pressed a single note in a darkened room and waited for something to answer. The first rain of spring arrived with an unapologetic downpour, drumming against the conservatory's glass-paneled dome like a symphony warming up before a storm. Lena stood beneath the overhang at the south entrance, eyes tilted toward the sky, her fingers curled around the leather strap of her composition folder. Inside it was the suite for unheard rooms, 6 movements, each one a story, a life, a door. She had finished the final pages 3 nights earlier, by lamplight in the same third-floor practice room where her journey had begun. The rain on the window had kept time as she wrote the closing bars, hands trembling not from fatigue, but from the knowledge that the piece was finally ready to leave her. It would premiere tonight. A full program, a formal audience, a chamber ensemble behind her, the conservatory's top-tier students beside her, and in the center, her. There were murmurs, of course, whispers about whether she deserved such a spotlight, about the politics behind her ascent, about whether Dr. Rice was playing favorites. She heard them all, but they no longer pierced her the same way. Truth had made her flame steady. It could still flicker, but not extinguish. Inside the great hall, final preparations unfolded like the hush before a curtain lifts. The board members took their seats, patrons filed in, wrapped in silk and purpose. Students paced the wings, clutching programs, instruments, and nerves. And Halbridge stood behind it all, at the edge of the crowd. He had been quieter since the article, since the fellowship offer, since his petition had quietly disappeared beneath the weight of Lena's performance. But he hadn't disappeared. He had lobbied the board behind closed doors, whispered about preserving legacy, pushed for reinforcement of standards. And when none of it worked, he sat with folded arms and waited for her to stumble, because that, to him, would be the true vindication. The unraveling of a girl who dared to speak with music before asking permission. Backstage, Lena sat in the corner of the green room, eyes closed, her fingers silently playing the air. Beside her was the only item she had carried from home, a frayed photograph of her younger self, no older than 10, seated at a busted upright in the corner of a shelter. She looked at it now and whispered, "We made it." Clara entered quietly, clipboard in hand. "They're ready," she said. Lena stood slowly. Clara reached out, adjusted a strand of her hair, then took her hand and pressed something into it, a small silver pin, etched with a single eighth note. "It was mine," she said. "My mentor gave it to me when I stepped on stage for the first time. I was terrified." Lena blinked against the sudden warmth in her throat. "Why give it to me?" "Because you're the bravest person I've ever seen walk through these halls," Clara said. "And because I want you to have more than applause. I want you to have memory." The stage lights burned hot as Lena stepped into them. The audience hushed. The program had already been announced. Her name was printed clearly, but when she sat at the piano, she spoke softly into the microphone beside her. "This piece is called Suite for Unheard Rooms. It's for the places people pass by without knowing someone lives there. It's for the girls who grow up invisible, for the boys who learn silence before they learn safety, and for anyone who's ever created something beautiful out of the ruins." Then she turned to the keys and played. The first movement opened like a breath held too long. Gentle, spare, just a few chords echoing into the high rafters. It was the sound of empty rooms and the people who once waited inside them. The second was sharper, faster, plucked strings from the chamber ensemble dancing behind her, mimicking the quick steps of someone running through a hallway trying not to be noticed. The third swelled with strings and minor harmonies, loneliness wrapped in elegance. The fourth, a room with one lamp, was written in 7/8 time, uneasy and unbalanced, just like the nights Lena had spent practicing while the world slept. Then came the fifth, Reverie in the Echo, where the melody curled around itself like a whispered memory. It was delicate, almost vanishing, until the final note hung like a lantern in the dark. And then, the final movement. No one in the room breathed. Lena closed her eyes and began the last piece, Open Door. It began as a lullaby, then rose. Rose like a cry for belonging, rose like a child finally being seen. At its climax, the ensemble swelled behind her, the harmony broke open. Notes collided and soared and spun. It was chaos and freedom and grief and joy in one moment. And then, just as quickly, it all dropped away. Silence. One final note. Sustained, held, and let go. When she finished, Lena didn't bow. She simply looked out at the crowd, tears on her cheeks, her hands resting in her lap. And the hall, every inch of it, stood. It wasn't applause, it was ovation. And for the first time, Lena didn't feel like she was trying to become someone. She was. Mr. Reynolds was there. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve and gave a small, proud salute from the back row. Clara wept openly beside the stage curtain. Dr. Rice, still and silent, clapped once, then again, then harder than he ever had. And Halbridge? He did not stand. But he was alone. And in a hall full of people who had just heard something truer than tradition, his silence spoke only of defeat. Later that night, after the crowd had gone, Lena returned to the stage one last time. The lights were dimmed, the hall was empty, but the keys still remembered. She sat down, ran her fingers along the edge of the bench. Then in the quiet, she whispered the only thing that truly mattered. Thank you, for every room that never heard her, for every voice that told her she couldn't, for every note that survived anyway. She played a single chord, let it echo, then stood and walked out, carrying not just her music but her story. Her own. Unmistakably, finally, hers. To anyone who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told they don't belong, Lena Dawson's journey is for you. Her story reminds us that true brilliance doesn't always wear polish. Sometimes it comes wrapped in silence, shaped by pain and carried by sheer will. Lena didn't have legacy, wealth, or prestige, but she had truth. And when she chose to play from her scars instead of her fear, The world finally had no choice but to listen. Let this be a lesson for every unseen artist, every underestimated dreamer. Your voice matters. Not because it conforms, but because it dares to exist. You don't need permission to become unforgettable. You don't need approval to be powerful. The most sacred stages in life are the ones you build yourself, key by key, story by story. And when the day comes that they try to reduce you to where you came from, remember Lena. She didn't just play a piano. She played her life. And in doing so, she changed everyone who heard it. So keep writing, keep playing, keep becoming. The rooms that once silenced you may one day echo with your name.